So when I was in college, I was involved with a ministry called Crew. It's a Christian organization that's on many college campuses around the world. And all kinds of students attend these weekly meetings. And it's a powerful time of connecting with God and with each other. When I was a freshman, one of our leaders spoke on this exact passage. And so two of the guys in our friend group decided that this message was something we needed to commit to over the next 4 years of college. So every time one of us said, yes, I'll be there, or yes, I'm going to do that, they would literally get in your face and go, let your yes be yes, every time. Okay? Now, this was a not-so-subtle reminder that we needed to be true to what we proclaimed and to stand in our commitments. Now, before this was ingrained in my head as a college student, honesty was always incredibly important to me. I'm a truth seeker by nature, and therefore it's always been of great value to me to mean what I say and say what I mean. And that applied to most of my life, unless it happened to involve my little brother. I mean, if I could take advantage of him in some way to work toward my benefit, I was all for telling him something that was not fully true. Just to be clear, that was not the norm for me, but when it came to my brother Jeff, I was pretty darn good at it. So one day we were driving up to my grandma's house in Michigan. It's a 3-hour drive. We've made it many times before. My brother was 11 at the time. I was 16, just to give you some perspective. And so we had traveled this road many times to our grandmother's, and I figured, he's 11. He's obtained this knowledge prior in his life, so I'm not responsible for making sure that he remembers this information. Our oldest sister was off in college, so it was just my mom, my dad, me, and my brother. I was not feeling well, feeling a little car sick, a little grumpy, and I just wanted to lie down across the back seat of the car. We just had a four-door sedan, nothing huge. And I don't find this an important fact to mention, but my brother, when he tells his story, he always has to share this piece. So I wanted to lay across the back of the seat, but the floor of the car had a big hump in the middle. Now, my memory says it was a very small hump, but his memory says it was huge. So I had to think quickly, and I had to figure out a way to convince my brother that my plan for me to lie on the seat was a good one. So unfortunately, I told him that it was a 6-hour drive to Grandma's house. Now again, he knew it was 3 at some point. And I told him, hey Jeff, how about this? I'll lie down on the seat for the first 3 hours, and then the second 3 hours, you can have the seat. So he looked at me and said, are you sure? I was like, yes, of course. Yeah, 3 hours for me, then 3 hours for you. That's a fair trade. Now, my brother was a pretty savvy 11-year-old, and he was not going to be suckered by his big sister. So he did what any reasonable kid would do, and he asked his parents. He said, Mom, Dad, Catherine says it's 6 hours to Grandma's house. Is that true? Now, my parents are deep into conversation, probably reminiscing about the first time their eyes locked across their high school classroom. And so they just say, yes. So now the game was on. My parents never were the wiser until we arrived at my grandma's, and let me tell you, my brother was one unhappy camper. He not only felt suckered by his sister, but he felt deceived by his parents. And he still tells this story today that he just told Felix last week. But I'm hoping one day it will drive him to a really good therapist, all right? But what's the point? My word meant nothing to him for quite some time afterwards. He lost trust in me, and he did not believe that I had his best interest in mind, which quite honestly, at the age of 16, my brother's best interest was not at the top of my priority list. In the moment, all that really mattered to me was getting my way. But I never stopped to think about how giving my brother my word about something and then actually lying, and he finds out later, how that would affect our relationship as we did life together in our family. Again, he has not forgotten it, but he's a pastor now, so I'm hoping he can forgive me. So our text today comes from the Sermon on the Mount, and I know it's been a few weeks since we've talked about the Sermon on the Mount in chapel, so I wanted to give us a quick reminder about what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. So most commentators agree that the Sermon on the Mount is a description of the lifestyle of those who belong to the kingdom of God. So Sinclair Ferguson explains it like this. Like, this is just a great sentence to remember. The Sermon on the Mount is not a sermon about an ideal life in an ideal world, but about the kingdom life in a fallen world. And this Sermon on the Mount is not just given by a preacher hoping to inspire you. It's given by the one who actually embodies the teaching. The teaching in the Sermon on the Mount will only change us if we choose to submit to the one who's giving it. So this sermon in Matthew encapsulates and gives life to the lordship of Jesus himself in our lives. Those who would have listened to Jesus preach these words on the hillside would have seen a total consistency between who Jesus is and what he says. Because Jesus was and is the epitome of integrity. So if we're choosing to live under the authority of Jesus, this sermon actually becomes our lifeline. And it teaches us, again, what it means to live a kingdom life in a fallen world. So if we focus in on our passage from today, giving this a little context, back in Jesus' day, right, the Pharisees were all about mapping out the proper course for everybody in terms of how you could attain righteousness. Right? Everybody knows this? Okay. And the rabbis actually had a hierarchy of oaths, an entire theology on oaths. So if you invoked the name of God, your oath was binding. That meant you meant what you said. You were going to do it. If you swore by Jerusalem or earth or heaven, your oath was not binding. If you swore toward Jerusalem, your oath was binding. And if you didn't invoke the name of God at all, your oath wasn't binding. So this was all about the legalistic and external obedience, seemingly good behavior and obedience to the law, with no attention to the inner obedience that comes from the heart. So what I want you to do right now is turn to your neighbor, okay, and give them one of those good old-fashioned pinky swears. You all did this when you were little, okay? So, in a lot of ways, this is like the infamous pinky swear. Now, if you turn to your neighbor and try to give them a promise based on your thumb, that would not be binding, right? But if you do it with a pinky, you really mean it, okay? So the thumb, while it might be a finger, it might appear to be binding, but really the pinky is what matters. So the Pharisees were all about how it looked on the outside, but had little to no concern on the state of someone's heart. So this is what Jesus is getting at in this passage. People were swearing under things, earth, heaven, Jerusalem, so that it was not binding. Jesus said this is hypocrisy. Earth is God's heaven. Earth is God's footstool, Heaven is his throne. He numbers the hairs on your head. No promise can ever be made without it being done in the presence of God. So you don't have to swear on anything. Your word is always spoken in the presence of God. Jesus also said this is dishonesty. Because when it's being done, you're trying to look like it's a serious commitment. But when you're trying to make your word look like your bond and it's actually rooted in deception, there is no integrity in that. And Jesus makes it clear that he hates this. He actually abhors it. And Jesus is saying, if you are swearing by something and your intent is to deceive, it must be from the devil. So when I tricked my little brother into lying on the bumpy floor of the car, that was not of Jesus. I was not living a kingdom life in a fallen world. I was living solely for me and what I wanted. So one does not need to call on God to make their word good. God is watching us, and he knows our hearts. So what does it mean to let our yes be yes? When I say yes to something, what does it mean to live into that? The way we live should speak to others about who we are. Our words should be trustworthy, and our word should matter. Christine Pohl explains that in our culture today, we have margarine, cleaning products, and health products named pledge, depends, ensure, and promise. So the idea of keeping our word and living up to our promise has been greatly watered down, right? So promise is something I spread on my gluten-free bread in the morning. It's not something I live up to. Advertisements promise us the best abs, amazing hair, an Instagram image that will put others to shame. And most of us, I hope, know better than to believe those promises. But then if we look at the state of our nation's politicians, we might wonder if keeping our promises is just foolish. It certainly appears to be countercultural to stand by our word, right? And again, Christ is calling us to live a kingdom life in a fallen world. David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, adds, we live in a society, and this is so good, that is in conspiracy against commitment making. How many of you love to make commitments? Okay? We got one guy raising his hand, right? If we would have said that 10 years ago, it would have been very different response. So students today are plagued by FOMO, which is what? Exactly, fear of missing out. We don't want to close off any options. We live in a culture that puts so much emphasis on individual liberty and personal choice. We live in a society filled with decommitment devices. Decommitment devices. The entire internet is commanding you to sample one thing after another. Tinder is luring students to sample one person after another. Our phones are constantly beckoning us to shift our attention. How can you possibly learn to make long commitments when you can't focus on anything for more than 30 seconds? Brooks goes on to describe commitment making as a vampire problem. Commitment making is hard, he says, especially for young people. One philosopher said it's like a vampire problem. Maybe you want to be a vampire. The problem is you don't know what it feels like to be a vampire. Vampire problems are the kinds where when you make the decision, you're actually making a decision to become somebody else. And it's very hard as your present self to know what it will feel like to be your future self. Going to college is a vampire decision. Your education will change you, but you don't know how. Getting married is a vampire decision. Marriage will change you, but you don't know how. Having kids is a vampire decision. Committing yourself to Jesus is a vampire decision because God will change you. So what does it look like to live the kingdom life in this fallen world? In this world that is constantly tugging at us to move toward the ever-elusive something better. A world that continually tells us that life is better on the other side of the fence. And we can get to the other side of the fence. All we have to do is buy this or wear that or experience this. And by the way, don't lock yourself in on the other side of the fence. Keep your options open, because there's going to be another fence that you're going to want to go over very soon. That's what we're being told. So what happens when we choose to say yes to an option and actually stand behind that yes? What happens when we say yes in the same direction over time? How would this impact our community here at Trinity and beyond? Christine Paul writes about 4 practices that sustain community, just 4 that she lists. One of those is making and keeping promises, letting our yes be yes. Paul describes promises as providing the internal framework for every relationship and every community. She says they function like the hidden supports in a well-built house, things we don't generally notice or call attention to, especially while they provide a safe structure. But as soon as they collapse, as soon as someone doesn't keep their promise in a relationship or a community, we definitely take notice. She continues on to say that when we make a promise, we voluntarily obligate ourselves to perform some course of action, often for another person's benefit. In doing this, we reach into an uncertain and unpredictable future with the intention of binding ourselves to someone or something. It is our intention in the present that then shapes or affects our future. Let me say that again. It's our intention in the present that shapes or affects the future. So to say it really simply, if I tell you that on Monday when we get back from fall break and you have this awful math test that morning, if I say, Felix, I'm going to pray for you during your math test, that means what I've just said now in the present is going to affect me on Monday morning at 10 a.m. when Felix is taking his math test. Because I'm going to stop, if my yes is yes, I'm going to stop and actually pray for Felix and do what I told him I would do. It also means that when I say I'm going to commit to the football team this year or to being an RA, that I'm affecting my future as I commit to that position or that role in the present. So this next year might be filled with early morning practices, late nights, lots of studying, sore muscles, but I will live up to what I said throughout the course of the next year. And I don't fully know what the next year holds in terms of playing football or being an RA, but I'm binding myself to my team and my community, and I'm going to be true to what I say, even when it's hard, even when it feels uncomfortable. Not just because it's important to me, but because Jesus calls me to this, because it's part of living a kingdom life in a fallen world in a relationship with Jesus. And we all know there are times when there are extenuating circumstances and we're unable to keep our word, or we might be in a relationship that's simply unsafe and we need to get out. Okay, that's not what we're focusing on today. We're focusing on letting our yes be yes, meaning what we say. Tested and proven promises and commitments are essential in our ability to trust one another. Without some measure of trust, we cannot do much of anything together as a community. It's really difficult to put forth energy into something if we can't trust others to do what they say they're going to do. How many of you have ever been in a group project in a class? Okay? How many, the last time you were in this group, a group project, how many of your group members did all they said they were going to do? Okay, we have a few. That's good. That's good. I'm glad to see that. Okay? So was there someone in your group that you don't ever want to be in a group again with? Who didn't keep their part or their promise on your team? How did this impact your relationship with them outside of the group project or the team that you were on? Keeping our promises is integral to personal integrity. When we don't keep our word, we actually lose part of ourselves. Margaret Farley explains it like this: to give my word is to place a part of myself or something that belongs to me into another person's keeping. It is to give that other person a claim over me, a claim to perform the action that I have committed myself to perform. When I give my word, I do not simply give it away. It claims my faithfulness and my constancy. She says, and I love this phrase, she says that promises help us stabilize our lives in the fickleness of our feelings. Promises help us stabilize our lives in the fickleness of our feelings. We can feel a certain way one day, and we can feel the exact opposite the next. It's only when we choose to live into the commitments we made, the yes we stated, that we live lives of faithfulness. Now, many of you have heard that love is a choice, right? So I'll tell you that after being single for many years, the yes part of marriage felt incredibly hard for me on some days. Some things about my life were way easier when I was a single person. And there were parts of me that longed to go back to that. But my yes meant yes. So together, my husband and I have worked through many difficult things, and our marriage is richer because of it. It is only in choosing to live into what I promise that my husband and I can grow deeper and deeper in intimacy. It's not because we only had one difficult time and phew, I made it through that one, so now I can rest. No, we face several challenges, but we both keep saying yes to each other. Even when we don't agree, even when we see things from a different perspective. Intimacy in marriage, in friendships, and in community only happens when we keep saying yes in the same direction. Only then will we see the fruit and the richness of being in deep relationship with one another. Ethicist Lewis Smedes shares, people choose not to quit when the going gets rough because they promised once to see it through. They stick to lost causes. They hold on to love grown cold. They stay with people who've become pains in the neck. They still dare to make promises and care enough to keep the promises they make. So if you have a ship, you will not desert. If you have people, you will not forsake. If you have causes, you will not abandon. Then you are like God. And this is who we're called to be, to become more and more like Christ. So when was the last time we actually stopped to think about how the practices of God and our faithfulness to yes be yes, the act of keeping our word, are actually connected? God has made promises to us. When we are not faithful, God is. God has chosen a covenantal relationship with us. Keeping his promises is central to who God is. And it's central to how he relates to us and how we relate to him. So it should never shock us that this ever-loving, ever-faithful, ever-truthful God who created us keeps his promises. In turn, this act of making and keeping promises is central to what is best in human relationships. We can't get around this. If we want to be in relationship, we have to take this seriously. So what happens when we keep saying yes? When we keep meaning what we say in the same direction? Since this is our Emerging Kingdom Leaders Chapel, for those of you who don't know, EKL is our one of our leadership programs on campus for freshmen. And I asked a recent grad what it was like for her to say yes to EKL over 4 years. She could have jumped from group to group, experienced more. I'm sure she missed out on some things. She could have always kept her options open. But instead, she chose to stay in her yes, all the way through college. So here's how her vampire decision changed her. This is what she said. Staying committed to one leadership group throughout my college experience has been powerful, to say the least. By staying committed to one ministry, I was not only able to better understand the vision of the program, I was able to step into and take hold of that vision. What I mean by this is, as I caught on to the vision, I was able to take part in making that vision come to life. I think it's really easy to join something and become an observer or a critic. It's much more difficult to join something, commit to it, see the flaws, and choose to be an active part in changing it. As you stick with something, you get to see the beauty in the making. You see the struggles and difficulties, but you also eventually see the fruit of the hard work you put in. You get to see people grow more into the people the Lord's created them to be, and you get to invest in others. She says another benefit to committing to one ministry for several years is you get to see your own growth. You really get to fine-tune both your strengths and your weaknesses. In regards to your weaknesses, if you were to jump from one ministry to the other, it could be easy to see some of your flaws, make note of them, but fail to see the effect that they have on the people around you in the long run. So a person could switch to a different environment where it may be easier to cover those flaws with new people in a new setting, or they could choose to stay and really face them. The idea of facing my flaws and my brokenness was a huge part of my journey through staying in one leadership program. And she finishes with, ultimately, I think the best example and reason to stay in something for the long haul is to look at Christ's example. The Lord doesn't just give us his Holy Spirit for 1 year and says, okay, transformation, let's go. No, he sees our brokenness and our beauty and says, all right, let's do this. He commits to being with us for our entire life and beyond. And this is how transformation takes place, through a constant and consistent investment. So what would it look like for us to live counterculturally, and with all the things that tug at our attention, let our yes be yes in the same direction, and allow God to use that commitment to change us more and more into his likeness? Let me pray. Lord, thank you for being a constant and faithful God, for being a father who keeps his promises, and for setting the example for us and making your yes a yes. Strengthen and encourage us as we seek to live into the yeses we proclaim and live a kingdom life in this fallen world. In your holy and blessed name we pray. Amen.